Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on philosophy, French postmodernism, and Jacques Derrida, or as his wife calls him in the movie Derrida, the biographical and documentary movie about his life, Jackie, as they're trying to leave his apartment and he's forgotten where he put his keys. I'm not sure if he needs the textual reminders or verbal. So, Jacques Derrida lived from 1930 to 2004. A couple of these French guys died in 2004, 5, 7, etc. And he is, much like Foucault, famous for his after-post-structuralist take. He is known as a postmodernist, not just a post-structuralist. Foucault is sometimes called a postmodernist. Technically, Foucault is supposed to be a post-structuralist who was a structuralist and then transitioned away from that a bit more, balancing out with existentialism and open-endedness. Derrida confronts Levy Strauss and structuralism early on and famously in his career, and then goes on to become what many call a postmodernist, although he did not necessarily call himself that, as well as he is into deconstruction, and thus some call him a deconstructionist, although he also disavowed that. Somewhat like Marx actually disavowed Marxism during his own life, not necessarily all of the theory, but some folks who called themselves Marxists. So, obviously Derrida was similarly somewhat upset with some of his followers, just a little bit. So he has a post-structuralist French take on the work of many we've already covered: Nietzsche, Heidegger, Searle, Levy Strauss, and other Germans and French and folks. His philosophy is sometimes known as mentioned, deconstruction. Like Foucault, Derrida takes systems apart to show the complex workings of pieces that are not set in stone but maintained through binary divisions that are always somewhat arbitrary, never perfectly set in perfect rules or stone. You remember with Levi Strauss, he wanted the universal rules underlying and structures cultures. Derrida says there are no, as a more Foucaultian and then after Foucault a postmodernist, he is trying to show that Levi Strauss is wrong and there are no complete binary divisions set in stone, although like Levi Strauss and many others, he does believe, like Foucault, he argues that binary divisions are used to maintain power and control and to try to set systems in place. So we are very binary apes and human beings. We are trying to separate good from bad and right from wrong and comfortable from odd and feeling terrible. But we never have those perfectly set cultural patterns. Levi Strauss was searching for them. Derrida says there are none. And he said that to Levi Strauss, in the face of Levi Strauss and many others early on. So like Barthes, Derrida was more concerned also with texts than with institutions. Derrida has a very interesting relationship with the text. He actually says that people have tended to be very textual lately, but have strangely, and I do somewhat myself actually, prefer verbal communication, and I'm actually actively thinking about that a lot nowadays with video and video chat. But Derrida actually wants to sort of set text free and allow it to be its own entity, and he likes to show how text is good and bad, so is talking, and text kind of gets a bad rap because talking directly is more favorable than text, let's say, not just texting on one's phone, but say to talk to somebody about their beliefs is better than reading what they've written about them, perhaps in some ways, but Derrida stands up for textuality a lot and shows how it's a different, interrelated thing, not just like verbal communication, but a whole different form of it. And I am very influenced by that, although I have my own thoughts. I like Wittgenstein and the beeping outside. Wittgenstein is very concerned with showing similar things with forms of life, although he speaks more like a down-to-earth pragmatist a bit than a long-flighted Frenchman. But Derrida had a very interesting upbringing. Many philosophers have been shaken early on and had shake-up in their parents or in the era they lived. Derrida grew up Jewish in French Algeria, North Africa, an adolescence that helped him recognize marginalized perspectives. So grew up the French, and, well, the Americans are somewhat anti-Semitic, so are the French, and then he grew up in a place full of Arabic, and like those teenage Arabs who were involved in The Stranger, Camus wrote about them as kind of a gang with a knife that intimidates a white guy, and Derrida grew up with Arabic and African, what we would often call black people in North Africa as a Jewish white guy with a lot of white French colonialism there. So that helped him be on many sides of the fence, yes. He was expelled from high school on his first day for being Jewish while France was occupied by the Nazis. So Derrida decided not to attend the segregated Jewish high school, and he enjoyed reading Nietzsche, Rousseau, Camus, and Sartre instead. He came along a little late in the game when those folks had already been decently canonized, because he is later in the game than the others. He is coming along a bit the generation after Foucault, in fact, and which is a nice place to be. Derrida completed his thesis on Searle, again, every day, Husserlin, the guy with whom Heidegger worked, and came up as a protege. And he came to America, Derrida did, to study at Harvard. He taught in France until '86, when he came to California to teach at UC Irvine until his death. Foucault taught at UC Berkeley. I believe Lyotard came out and taught at UCLA. I forgot to mention that, didn't intentionally. And Derrida taught at Irvine, which means the UCs out here. I am from California, and the UC system has seen a famous French person or two, and that is the public university system, which is where French folks would want to be. Often. I'm not going to judge here. In 1966, again, a lot of these are former Maoists, so they like public institutions occasionally. In 1966, Derrida gained a following after giving a lecture at a conference on structuralism at Johns Hopkins. Let's try to say everything correctly. Where Peirce taught Dewey. I am going to do the pragmatic talks next. Actually, it's going to be skipping a little back in time, but I'm then going to cover the Americans. So he taught at Johns Hopkins, where Peirce taught Dewey, with Lacan and many other prominent scholars in attendance who had flown to the thing. In his lecture called Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, Derrida argued that systems must center and organize themselves to be coherent and limit free play. There are somewhat rules. But there is also freedom for substitution and exchange within the system itself. The chief and the noble lords don't perfectly have rules, but they have preferences, and power does hold things down, but not entirely. There is still, again, Hegel says, the feeling of being alive is the feeling of being in contradiction with oneself. A lot of this German and French thought is post-Hegel. It is all very contradictory and not resolved, and that's the state in which it remains. So no matter what the system, in fact, this goes with Lacan and Heidegger for your own individual self as well as your world. If we studied with Heidegger, you and yourself and your world are open and closed both. So the center of the structure is within yet also outside the structure. Just like the beeping is outside again, which I have heard I can hear better than you through the mic, but yes. Governing what is permissible within the structure, but ungoverned by the structure itself. The center is, paradoxically, the coherence of the structure. Think the Hawaiian kahuna kind of gets to tell everybody what feathers are not to wear and whether or not they get to eat pork. Apparently in some Hawaiian culture, the men get to eat pork, and the noblemen, nobody else does, or like the kahunas, etc. But it's actually ungoverned in that the kahuna is like, I don't know, maybe today on a Tuesday, that this, my haphazard example, is that power holds power down and tries to rule, but of course power is hypocritical. Human beings are hypocritical and contradictory, so actually there's paradigm shift and breakage and rupture and paradigm shift and all of that because it's all too human. This is basically describing a lot of Nietzsche and Heidegger, again for a conference of post-Nietzschean, somewhat influenced by French thought, anthropologically minded folks. We desire coherence, we want rule and order and security, and demand this of structures. We want science and religion to stand for things and to have concrete answers. But just like Wittgenstein's child at the blackboard, which I have not covered just yet, and I will go into Wittgenstein extensively, I plan to, in fact, I am going to be covering Poe and Lewis Carroll in the month of April, and then in the month of May I'm going to be doing Wittgenstein month. That is what my plan is, and it's going to be a heck of a plan, I hope. We cannot really center the center. What Wittgenstein says is the child just snaps into long division at the blackboard. It could be a different practice. It's not. It has problems. Long division is not perfect. You can't divide by zero in certain ways. It's an imperfect manipulation of systems in human practice. You can talk about whether ideal numbers practice things ideally somewhere else in another dimension. I don't care. I can't see any of that or unicorns. Neither nor for Kierkegaard. Basically what we got. I don't see him either. Neither mean neither. We cannot center the center. We cannot make the coherence itself completely coherent. We can't get the kahuna or the powers that be to be completely unhypocritical or not lose track of things and follow rules. Again, as Lisa says, but who's going to police the police? And Homer says, Coast Guard? This results in an infinite regress. Does the Coast Guard police the outer edges of the police? We are desirous and anxious, as Heidegger argued, and so we play social games within systems seeking stability and coherence, placing ourselves at stake within the game and making the game a presence for ourselves. Derrida argues that games and structures are constantly being recentered. Kind of like an American football game, or also like an Australian rugby game, or like any game where there's a huddle and I'm sure there's plenty of other games like this, where the center of the game moves to a certain part of the field. Hockey is also like this, is that there's a certain scrimmage right in a certain position, as they call it, a scrimmage, where the ball or the puck or what have you centers the game in a certain spot. The game is constantly being recentered. Well, now the political issues are this. Now they're this. They're still the same. They are somewhat different. So it's recentered sequentially, thing to thing to thing. It doesn't have to go in simply, we don't have to imagine it in a line necessarily, especially if it's geographical, as a series of locations. Time and space is very Heidegger. Bringing time and space into things is very Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and that is very useful. I constantly am trying to situate things and relativize them in time and space rather than leave them universal and abstract, which is very Wittgenstein, and Derrida likes to talk more French than squarely like that. The center is constantly being recentered. The focus of activity, like American football, is always shifting to something else that was not the focus. Of course, somewhat the ball. Just as a word or concept is substituted for the thing it signifies, and metaphors substitute one thing for another, a new center and focus is always being substituted for the old. Think of your attention span individually and the social attention span of the group. However that works. Derrida claims that the history of metaphysics, science, structuralist anthropology, and the West is a progression of substituting one metaphor for another. We take our metaphors a bit too literally and think there are rules, or there is science, yes, when there is and isn't. Much like Kuhn's paradigm shift, where there is and isn't good answers, and it's a better answer, and then there's a better but also not so good answer that comes along better. For certain purposes. Perhaps the answers branch apart and become different fields and practices. For example, the West, aka white people plenty, is identified and re-identified with reason, freedom, and science to center its identity. I will say that one more time, because regardless of how this culture behaves, I do believe it is still legal for me as a California teacher to tell you the West is identified and re-identified with human reason, human freedom, and human practices, which we now lump practices that are intelligent and actual and physical under scientific expertise as science often as the correct part, even though we don't know how much is war or agriculture, neither nor. The West, China, etc. Nobody actually here or there knows entirely how much science is agriculture or not. But we know that we are reason and freedom, and that's the West. Is China? I often ask my students, is China reason and freedom? As they do so much science, they get weird looks on their face because we identify ourselves with reason, freedom, and science as core to this culture, no matter how human we behave. To ask about the center of the structure. Now again, asking this kind of thinking is dangerous, as Nietzsche and Derrida says. Just questioning the powers that be is limited to the extent as I am, is questioning everything you know, and everyone you know, and raising doubt, uncomfortable feelings of oddness, feelings that things don't fit, as Wittgenstein says. To ask about the to misspeak again. Me or you or whom the heck ever, asking about the structure of the center, the structure of the structure, what are the rules of the rules, the metaphysics, yes, is to throw things into question, philosophy, and face anxiety, Heidegger and French Heideggerianism, as the center is not permanently structured, the center is not permanently centered. You could say, well, the Georgia, football center, and it's like, well, maybe they tear it down. The structure is not permanently structured. It is structure-ish in what we do. You could say human sociology and anthropology is uncle-ish, perhaps, with Levy Strauss. Is it haunting? Depending on how we raise the apes. The structure is also paradoxically a rupture. Now, this guy, Derrida, knows his bataille. So the center of the football game is a rupture. Think about how the feeling of being alive is a feeling of being in contradiction with oneself. The reason we make sports people all wear the same uniforms is so that the plays that are exceptional stand out and everybody oohs and ahs, because that layup was amazing in particular because you make everything else the same. And the center of the American football game, or in fact in basketball, when you throw the ball up, it's a jump ball, is that the center of stability is also the center of chaos and activity. Think of that. That the very center of stability of the game, where the jump ball happens, is also the center of action and chaos and the novel and the new. What a contradictory form of life. This is, of course, true about everything. We simply use the football and or the basketball game because it is a recentering and a game. I will get into Poe and Wittgenstein and games and why they are such great metaphors and representations, very specifically with Poe's detective stories soon. We cannot, thus, make the system a permanence, can never bring it fully into presence. It is very Derrida, coming from Heidegger, to talk about presence. You are never fully, completely present to yourself. I'm fully here, I've arrived, I'm ideal. You're always present, but also a bit absent and missing to yourself. And it feels like society is present and absent too. It feels like science is complete but incomplete and resulting in better theories. So science, religion, politics, the groups, the individuals, they are open and closed, which is Heidegger. So the meaning and the feeling and the reality of being an individual and having rules in your life, having science and religion, is both open and closed as what it is, as a contradictory form of life, a la Hegel, Heidegger, etc. German thought moving into French. It is always an infinite regress, thus, of Heidegger's horizon without end. There is no focus that brings an end to our refocusing, as we move along with the game in which our faith is at stake. It is always somewhat a faithful play, yes, because we don't arrive fully. It's a bit like Godot. The meaning of a system of meaning is never absolute, as there is no sameness without difference, no presence without absence. Think about the sports game and how you are walking around trying to figure out who you are. I believe it is in the Vedas, one of my favorite phrases of Indian philosophy. All creatures on earth try to be, run around, frantically, trying to be, not realizing they already are. Being is becoming. Being is non-being. Being and non-being together, as being is continuous absence, lack, and becoming. Both is not together in transition continuously. Very Taoist, as Heidegger liked. No structure, not even structuralism, can be fully structured, as structures are systems of substitution and play. This is still the summary of Derrida's lecture. He is delivering this at Johns Hopkins in '66, this talk, to Levi Strauss and Lacan and others of the Structuralist lunch party. At least those two, and many others who know who they are and respect those guys very much. He is arguing through what I am saying that Levi Strauss must be wrong about uncles or any permanent structure of uncles. He's working his way up to incest, unfortunately, which is going to prove his point, and is the famous moment here. Derrida names Nietzsche as the one who called metaphysics and morality into question. I have to say, a lot of these guys, like Nietzsche, they follow Nietzsche in thinking the West has been very into reason and categoricalness, but we need to learn to be a little more like the East. I actually dissuade people from thinking the West is unlike the East and that we need to get more, say, like not monolithic, more bivalent. I think you'll find in wisdom in Taoism and the world over them telling people not to be so monolithic and reasoning and one-sided, but they have to tell you that over and over again in mystical systems. So I do caution people not to think the East is a more open-minded bunch of cultures and the West has been so close-minded, which does, I have to say, that is what it sounds like. Nietzsche is the one who came along and said we can be open-minded and individualistic, certainly more individualistic with the times, but I caution people against, and even here, I do think there's a bit of Western centrism in Nietzsche and Derrida, much love, but I'm of a later generation, yes? Derrida was doing this in 66. I wasn't alive for a while after that, and he's doing his first hardcore work then. The thing is it's not Nietzsche who's the first one to come along and make the West a special place that could or could not make or break something. Although Derrida thinks smarter than that. But I don't think Nietzsche is actually the one who called metaphysics into question. I've studied Christian mysticism in the Middle Ages. Nietzsche definitely would not think he's the only one. But Nietzsche does think the West is in a time of crisis in the 1800s, aka white people who more so called themselves West in the 1800s and then onward, and Americans particularly after World War II. Call stuff not the European Christendom, but the West, because of Auschwitz and Treblinka, Gesundheit, and a lot of other stuff. Much apologies, and again, not well, for my casual jokes, So with all of that, Derrida does say Nietzsche is the one who calls metaphysics and morality into question. He means he's definitely talking for the West. Again, I think we can talk as human beings very much and say, well, I'm from California, you might be from France, people might be from China. We can start talking as human beings and know that human behavior is human behavior in general culture. But Derrida definitely is standing with the West, thinking Nietzsche is a figure of the West. And that is how he is talking. And I just have to point that out because I have to go a little farther here and say I don't really believe in talking about Nietzsche as the one for the West who did this. But Heidegger does. And Derrida and Foucault very much follow Heidegger in thinking Nietzsche was the sunburst, was the new sun for the West. Who else is talking? I don't know. We don't have to talk that way necessarily. And I don't to my class. But because they're not just white people or people from the West, I teach Mongolian students online, etc. So I have a different audience. And we do now. At least we're not at Harvard. I ain't. Yeah. This again, as the great joke I love from the critic says, and now back to my job as English professor at NYU's. Derrida also calls attention to the work of Freud, in which the self is not the self, and Heidegger, because it's id, superego. And Heidegger, for whom being there is both being here and being elsewhere. Dasein, and that's about as good and non-controversial a place as you can put it, and I'll just let Derrida be Derrida. These critical thinkers must circle themselves, circumscribe themselves, and try to draw their philosophy together into a coherence, and Heidegger and Nietzsche don't even try entirely, but they do a bit. Using thought to criticize thought, trying to circle the circling. The thing that circles thought things tries to circle itself imperfectly. Is open and closed, in contradiction with itself, alive, using concepts to criticize conceptions, fashioning new systems to criticize system building. Similarly, Saussure and semiology had to use the word and concept sign, he says, to signify signs and signification. Levi Strauss's structuralism was thus an impossible task to complete, Derrida argues, even though its work was significant and worth the effort. There's a lot of philosophy like that I like. It's definitely a good answer, not good enough, but it got people to thinking, and it produced more answers. As soon as we question human systems, we are engaging in systemization that can itself be questioned, but only when not engaging in it. Which means it's very much Lee Braver is a guy from University of South Florida, wrote a book called Groundless Grounds. He usefully says in comparing Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein in explaining how similar their thinking is. And it's very similar to Derrida here, who's very Heideggerian. If you're going to dig, you can't dig under your feet. You have to stand in the next spot over and dig where you used to be standing. We can do things as if we're standing on them, and then we can criticize what we're doing. But just like you have to pivot back and you have to stop and think, what did I just say? And then talk about what you talked about. We can stop and stand in something else to criticize what we were doing, but we can't criticize what we're doing while we're doing it so well, let's say. Just like you can't dig underneath your own feet very well because you would destabilize yourself. So we constantly have to be shifting back and forth and pivoting to different positions. This is actually what Hume says about religion, that peasants pivoted with religion in the Catholic Church against the nobility when the nobility were abusive, and as feudalism was plenty. So he says, don't think religion is just controlling people. He says in a time of liberating itself somewhat, as it is slowly from the Catholic Church, he says, don't think religion was just holding people back politically. It's pivoting back and forth with for and against politics, etc. I encourage people. Badiou says a very similar thing. I wouldn't really worry about whether or not you believe in institutions that exist. I would worry more whether or not you're open-minded enough to pivot back and forth for and against different systems of thought and institutions and use them to critique each other. If you find that you can't, You may not be as may not be as capable of critical thinking in the name of religion, science, politics as much as you think. All of these systems, Christianity, science, politics, all praise you as a free-thinking individual now who can come to them and really truly drink of the deep water that is true, but they all say that. Because they all want to be trustable, and we live in an era where you definitely want to tell people they need to critically think because they've been exposed to a lot of foolish thinking. And even foolish thinkers want to think they're critical thinkers, yes? So you would not tell people in Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, the largest cultures that have ever existed, that they're uncritical people. I meet people all the time, they're like, well, science believes in critiquing itself and being rational. So does all of religion. How well did they do? What do you think? Just think of a religion that's not yours, whether or not you're religious. How well did all that go? Do you feel it? Do you feel a bunch of science and critical thinking in Islam or China? If you don't, what do they feel about us? How does it feel one way or the other? That is definitely what I believe in dangerously raising. And again, there are no easy answers here. Here I do not mean just rebel, it'll be fine. It is that you have to pivot, and pivot wisely, with perspective, that is wisdom. So each great thinker questions the last, as Heidegger did of Nietzsche and Derrida does of Heidegger. He actually mentions all of this, but he doesn't say, and I'm questioning Heidegger. I mean, either me, Eric, or Derrida, because he's not praising himself in the piece. But I mention, Derrida argues that the current questioning of metaphysics and meaning is bound up with the critique of ethnocentrism. That's anti-racism, which means Derrida joins Nietzsche and Bataille in my book as an anti-racist, and I am also an anti-racist. Much love to everyone, So he says that there is a critique of ethnocentrism, of Europe establishing itself as the West, and the questioning of this identity. Now, why would Europeans in German and then French thought, given what happened and given Derrida's high school experience or lack thereof, why would they be questioning belief in things and belief in science and reason and democracy in the name of ethnocentrism? Why would they be questioning this in the 60s? I don't remember it, so maybe I was there. Levy Strauss's Anthropology, now this is, again, Derrida is lecturing Levy Strauss and a bunch of other people at this conference, and he says, which means he's calling out Levy Strauss in front of everybody, nicely, Levy Strauss's Anthropology, which called all ethnic differences into question by seeking the underlying similarities. If there's a universal pattern of uncles or not, or shifting around, then that would mean essentially racism is somewhat bunk because everybody is similar with uncles. Derrida says that this is structuralism, a branch of philosophy and science which calls all differences into question by seeking the underlying universal patterns, which it does. But of course, Derrida is saying that's impossible. As philosophy questions metaphysics and science questions biological ethnicity, they simultaneously and paradoxically establish and pronounce the identity of philosophy, science, and the West, to separate the philosophical from the unphilosophical, the scientific from the unscientific, the West from the rest, as I always like to say. Derrida argues that we cannot escape this paradox, just as neither Nietzsche nor Heidegger could fully escape metaphysics nor closed conceptions of truth. But we can be careful and critical, responsible for the strategies we employ in the game more transparently and with greater awareness, which maybe is itself an infinite regress and Sisyphean task and slope, yes? Clearly, Derrida is calling ethnocentrism into question as a strategy. Philosophy and science and the ethnocentric West, and again, people are very tribal, are all centers of systematic, coherent activity, but at the center, they are free to be paradoxical and incoherent. But who's going to police the police? Establishing distinctions and identities while seeking the similar and universal. So what this does mean is the cops are going to tell you they are universal law and they always treat everybody fairly. They are not going to be that everywhere. They're going to be human, all too human, and they are going to say they are law and order, and that is how it is phrased. Dun, 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 dun. Levi Strauss had sought to find the underlying universal rules of culture. His central example being, I didn't get too into it at the time, prohibition of incest, which he argues is something universal, that sexual relationships within the family are verboten. Derrida argues as soon as this is provided as a universal rule, it calls itself into question. Why? Well, if incest is universally wrong, and if people keep saying that, then how can it be a scandal or wrong, or why would anybody point it out? Why isn't it just human beings never think? Wouldn't it be more, if Levi Strauss is right, wouldn't human beings just never conceive of incest as a possibility? Why would they realize it happens? Again, let's not talk about which states of this union the Chinese can easily put in their newspapers, up in front of everybody, being like, these people? Civilization? I don't think so. If incest happens, and if it's a universal prohibition, if it's often considered wrong, but if it happens, then it's not a universal metaphysical rule. It might be actually invisible and impossible for us. Derrida is very much about the impossible being actually possible, even if it is the impossible. So in a certain sense, we could be in a small, close-knit community and be like, incest is impossible. No one would do that. But of course, we would, in a certain sense, be fooling ourselves a bit. Let's hope not, and truly right then. If it could not be violated, if we could not commit incest, it would not be a rule at all, would not have no meaning or direction for human activity. It would be in contradiction with itself as an imperfect human practice. The violation of a rule is a condition of its possibility. And thus there can be no universal rules, neither in metaphysics nor cultural practice, is what Derrida argues. You are welcome to agree or disagree in your papers and or in your opinions if you're not writing anything for me. Levi Strauss could not separate unchanging universal nature from various particular cultures, just as Wittgenstein cannot, I haven't covered him just yet, does not separate logic from various language games and situational practices. For Wittgenstein, basically a logic is anything verbal that happens to be a practice with everything else in the practice. So a logic is not an inward mental nor simply verbal thing. That is very Derrida in the spirit of what's going on. And Wittgenstein is a lot like Heidegger, as Lee Braver points out, and Derrida is trying to be another folk, French folk like Heidegger. Derrida notes that in the later work of Levi Strauss questioned his own structuralism as a mythology itself, a mythology of all mythologies. This doubling and reversal and doubting does not result in nothing but more productivity, more life, but like any questioning produces answers and further questioning of its answers. Thinking continues to shift and requires no permanent center. So, the works of Derrida that followed this lecture, as well as the work of many deconstructionists following Derrida, put free play of meaning on display, showing it can always double back and displace itself, showing that dominant meanings can be questioned and marginalized. While this has angered many scientists such as Alan Sokal, there was something called the Sokal scandal where a scientists put a fake physics paper saying, oh, I'm a physicist, I know physics, let me put this in your journal. And the humanities journal said, okay, we can put your physics in our thing if you want to. And they weren't physics people. And he said, I was just lying. That was all fake physics. You guys will believe anything. And of course, some people say that's because philosophy just speaks nonsense. But of course, that's not really fair if they're not physicists. If I came along as an anthropologist, of course, you don't have an anthropology guy. I say, hey, here's some anthropology. You take it on the face of it. I say, hey, this backs up some of your physics. And you do me the gracious honor of, letting me print in your journal. Then I turn around and say, by the way, I was entirely lying and fooling you. Well, philosophers are not experts in physics, but perhaps they should have been smarter or checked, across the aisle or something like that with that. But again, I don't like the so-called scandal much, to be honest, as a philosophy guy and somebody who does believe there's some merit to Derrida's ideas, and he's not just trying to fool people. Sometimes people accuse this kind of thinking, French-German thought, of just being charlatan-ish, of just trying to sell people cars and trying to dissuade people from science. Hopefully, if you understand this is a guy giving a talk at Johns Hopkins to Levi Strauss and everybody else, he's not trying to convince an unscientific crowd of anything, but heck. Again, if this all makes you forget about science entirely, my apologies, but you need to change your diet or something. I'm not sure what. Again, seek nutritionists. Or physicists, perhaps. I don't know, if you have a spherical cow. So, analytic philosophers, such as John Searle, have been particularly angered by this. In fact, we have a little tiny bit here to do on John Searle and the limited ink. But I am actually going to break this talk here in half. I am going to try to make my talks a bit more condensed to 30 to 40 minutes rather than let them tread upon the hour. But John Searle was a philosopher. I took a class with him. I took philosophy of mind with John Searle. He believes there is objective truth. I am not the biggest fan of his theories. He believes there is objective truth. If you say something, you can mean it objectively, and he says that in short books. Derrida comes against him And this is all, the debate is captured in Derrida's book, Limited Inc., Limited INC, which I do like that book. I took a class with Searle. I was a bit upset with him. I do share this with folks. He definitely thinks there is objective truth, and he does not mind telling you and me that if you believe in subjectivity, and I did mention, well, I've come from a family of psychology, so how could a person just simply objectively know what they mean? And he told me I was wrong. I'm not sure how I was wrong, but yes, he was one of the big people at Berkeley. His star has fallen a tiny bit. Something about clear objectivity in all situations and honesty, I don't know. But anyway, with all of that, I'm going to give him a slight bit of roasting here with Derrida in Derrida's Limited Inc. Because actually I do believe in, as Hans Sluga, I took a class my freshman semester with Hans Sluga, who says that reality is psychological and historical. Hey buddy, it has cats too. Come here, buddy. Yes, Limited Beast Incorporated is my tiger. I took a class my freshman semester, first semester at Cal with Hans Sluga, who taught a bunch of philosophers, including Foucault, and a bit of Nietzsche my first semester, and said truth is historical and psychological. And simultaneously, I took philosophy of mind with John Searle, who said truth is objective and rational. If you don't believe in that, you are an idiot and unscientific. I prefer Sluga. And I'm going to give another talk here about, not my cat, although that would be nice. But while I attempt to vocally communicate with my cat evermore, yes, unending, I will give another talk here on Derrida's book, Limited Inc., and his debate with John Searle, which began in '72 and continued for a while. And it is a book you find used in this town, which means people buy it and they like it. So yeah, the back and forth between Searle and Derrida, and the sock puppet Derridarl, which I will mention, a bit of an invention of my own, but not entirely, I will mention next talk here. Yes. Yes. Anyway, much love to this cat and you. And kisses. And again, as always, and we'll pick up here, and I'll give another talk here in a second. I will, as usual, see ya, if I ever do, ever see ya.